All right, this is a video in response to a couple of articles that I read. I mean, really, it started with a YouTube video, um, and then I found out there was an article version of that, and it kind of I just happened to read this other thing in the same week, and it kind of got me thinking along the same lines, and so I wanted to talk about that. So the first article, this is actually the second one that I read. This isn't the one that sparked it, but this is a Substack article by Alex McCann. Don't know who he is. Haven't read any of his other work. Um, but he's talking at the beginning of the article about talking to like his friends who do corporate work and they can't say what their jobs really are. And they're kind of doing like make work, funny work as consultants and stuff. They're paid well. But so he brings up, David Graeber, bullshit jobs, and is like talking along those lines that like yeah, everyone knows they're not really working on anything real and blah blah blah. But this is the part that I found really compelling and interesting. It's just this anecdote by Alex here. He says, what's emerging is something very interesting. People are building, oh shoot, let me share. Okay. um yeah, Alex McCann, Death of the Corporate Job. Here we go. This section. What's emerging is something very interesting. People are building parallel systems of actual value while maintaining their corporate personas. I know developers who do their official job in the morning and build their own products in the afternoon. Marketers who run their agencies from their corporate desks, consultants who've automated their actual deliverables and spend most of their time on side projects. They're using the corporate infrastructure, the steady salary, the laptop, the stability as a platform for building something real. The corporate role has become a funding mechanism for actual work. Um, okay, corporate entrepreneurship, blah, 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 blah. So, um, I won't say that I've seen this a lot where people are just using their job as like an income and they're working on something totally separate, but I have seen, especially developers. I've seen this multiple times now in the last 5 years where developers that I know are trying to sort of carve out agency for themselves, and they're trying to build parallel systems. They're sort of rejecting products that they're hired to work on, and they try desperately to work on their own project, right? To be the author of their own project. And sometimes that's suggesting a big refactor on an existing tool or just trying to get, you know, corporate or organizational funding for their own projects and stuff. And, some environments like this is just how it works, right? As a developer, you are responsible for proposing prototypes and gathering consensus and getting funding and everything. Some things were, but I've seen this across a few different industries and kind of types of workplaces at this point. Is software developers are sort of trying to build their own kind of hustles in their workplace. Um, and I've seen it in myself too. I definitely have. I mean, I'm at a point in my career where I am pretty confident in my some of my like technical expertise and my taste and um my vision and experience, and it leads me to think that I can uh that I know better, right, than like the workings of an organization, and and that I should be the kind of sole author or the leader of something separate and different and something that I own, right? Um, Seen it myself, seen it in other developers. So another article that I read, and this is where, so this is what really sparked everything. There's this YouTuber Nick Olas, it's probably not his real name. I'm guessing that's his YouTube or it is his YouTube handle. I'm guessing it's got to be Nicholas is his name, and he turned it into Nick Olas, right? German German guy, and so he has this You can find the YouTube video, or he actually published a written article of the same title, Is Free Software a Cope? And this actually gets more into what I think is like underlying this thing that I've seen in myself and other developers. This sort of desire to exercise creative control and agency. And Nick puts it in the language of like free software and open source software. He's, a free software, open source software enthusiast, as probably a lot of us as developers are. But he really compares the freedom, so-called, of software kind of in contrast to the constrained and unfree industrial system of actual computers and hardware. That there's these kind of black boxes that we just sort of are accepting the output of industrial production of computers, and then we're trying to like carve out this space of freedom for ourselves in free software. And he questions in the article, is that just, is interest in free software just a cope for the fact that there really is a lot of unfreedom? There's overwhelmingly unfreedom in this system. So yeah, talks about how it's really not feasible to like repair your own hardware. It's hard to understand how this giant stack is actually working. They're so incredibly complex, it's practically impossible for one person. Anyways, big industry or big tech, in any case, let's just say big faceless companies, are not something that's particularly liked in the free software space, because big tech industry is pretty bad when it comes to anything related to freedom and user control or privacy, among other aspects. I'd actually be interested to kind of get into this, like the system of values, because I think this is quite interesting. But he goes on, tethered to big industry, blah, blah, blah. Furthermore, it could be said that free software extremism, we are trying to compensate for the shackles that computers in themselves put us in. In some sense, I think this is obviously true. We're trying to control the black box that hardware is by means of software and make it do what we want. And computers are tools, so making them do what one wants is kind of the point. But who would ever emphasize their free use of their tool to such a degree if they were not trying to compensate for their obvious lack of freedom, which stems from the usage of the tool itself? Is this not a cope? And then he kind of undercuts this question, or I don't know about undercuts it, but he proposes that free software is an accomplishment in the project of freedom. I'm kind of left. I find the middle part of the article here maybe a little more compelling, like raising this question, right? Are we really free? Is free software really free? Well, one thing I would say is I think there's been some good journalism to show that the first wave of kind of the open source movement in the 90s was really heralded by corporations, that open source software was a strategy to get free development labor from communities of users, instead of having service level agreements where these companies had to respond to bug reports and do all of that on their own. My understanding is that one of the fathers of open source software viewed it as a pro corporate, like as a cost cutting measure. So there's that. But I think just like the, truly free software and open source software, with permissive licenses, I mean, I experienced that freedom, right? Like when I find these little niches where I have cheap compute, some of the work I've done with like microcontrollers and stuff feels this way to me, where I have like cheap compute, an open source software stack, and then I can just write whatever software, whatever applications I come up with for that. It's under my control. I can understand the parts that I'm working on, right? And I can even uh, sort of, with like microcontrollers, you can even kind of aspire to a level of understanding that goes beyond just complete viewing it completely as a black box. Obviously, like no one is gonna like, right? Very few people in the world maybe understand the full stack from top to bottom completely, where they could watch, they could keep zooming in with a magnifying glass and say, this is what's happening here, this is what's happening here. But I mean, with microcontrollers, sometimes those the specs are published, and you can get your head around that a little bit. What I'm trying to say is I experience a feeling of creativity and freedom when I open up my terminal and I open up my editor and I start making electricity flow in my computer in a way that like I can accomplish goals that I set out for myself, or or professionally, right? That I can um, fulfill objectives for my employer, for clients that I have, and like tricky goals are just a matter of time and resource, right? I think once you've stretched yourself to a certain point with software development, you do realize that if it's possible to instantiate in the processor of the computer, right? If it's representable as memory in a computer, it's possible that you can do it. And it's just a question of uh, you know your limitations, your understanding, your skills, and there's a real freedom, and there's a real kind of feeling of creative control and power in some circumstances. But I would say my experience, going back to this desire to be sort of the author of software and sort of be in this hero position, these like fantasies you have about like heroically saving your company or your team or whatever by your intelligence and skill as a developer. Like, I've never actually seen that work out quite like that, right? There's always compromise, and even rock star developers. I don't consider myself a rock star developer by any means, but even when I have encountered really hardcore developers, that they're bounded too. They have limitations themselves, and they encounter obstacles and limitations with projects and in these environments. Um, and maybe I've rambled on long enough about this, but I will say too that along with kind of the freedom of solo development, that kind of empty canvas of your editor, and the ability to pursue like really granular perfection, error handling, case handling, edge handling in a program, or not, to go really high level and kind of start working on like architecture and systems level design. There's a freedom there, but I've also seen even really brilliant developers get lost in the sauce on their own projects, right? There's a real, I would call it maybe like a kind of discipline that being in an organization brings to software development, that like taking other people's feedback and having product managers and workplace like people managers and clients and people using your software making bug reports. Those really are like I just haven't seen a way to like replicate that with kind of individual project development or solo development, right? Like people building their own portfolios. I think even really good developers sometimes make kind of whatever kind of lame, like, right, they're I've never seen a solo developer like synthesize that kind of context for them, like conjure all of that to make a really compelling software product totally on their own. I think there's like a power to being connected to like real needs and a kind of stream of feedback about what you're developing and changing tack and uh, reducing scope or maximizing scope of your project, not based on what you think is fun or interesting or even good or whatever. It's just like you're taking signal from a market or a company or a client or whatever. So there we go. I think we're having maybe a crisis of control. And that's what I'll leave it on. I think we're in a time where uh, controlling anything feels maybe a little bit impossible. And yeah, we're trying to cope with that. We're trying to cope with the problem of freedom and the loss of freedom. And we're sometimes engaging in fantastical, magical thinking about what we can do in the face of the freedom that we're losing.